Hello everybody, if you're hearing this at the correct upload time, that means I'm still alive and somewhere on the east coast of the United States, probably waiting to head out to my flight to get home, although thanks to the vagaries of the US Flight Transport Solution, despite the fact I'll be somewhere in the Baltimore DC area, it's actually cheaper for me to fly all the way back to Seattle, then down to Salt Lake City, and then back to London. Go figure. Anyway, welcome to Drydock episode 264. This week, the questions are taken from Guide 326 and 327. That's the, weirdly enough, duplicated guide to the Blake-class cruisers and the Argentine 25 de Mayo class heavy cruisers, along with the Wednesday videos about USS Franklin and HMCS Hyder, and the Friday video about able seaman Just Nuisance. Hunter3547 asks, why did early steam-only warships, such as the Blake class, have so many yardarms that no longer support sails on their masts? Were all of these yards for signal hoists, or did they serve other non-sail purposes? There are a number of non-sail purposes for the various yardarms. Partly it is for signal flags, as you can see here in this picture of HMS Blake, with her yardarms supporting the halyard lines for the signals. Over there at her stern. Also, albeit probably not originally an intended use, they were also very good at supporting laundry lines, because remember, we're still talking about the middle part of the second half of the 19th century. So if you're out in the tropics, or indeed you're sailing at any great speed, it's probably actually faster and more economical and easier on the crew to just hoist all your wet laundry on lines, and obviously the lines need something to connect to, as opposed to running them through a mangle or something similar down below, which will probably still leave them slightly damp. Then, albeit somewhat later than Blake in her format as seen in this picture, they were also quite useful for running radio lines, basically radio antenna for long-wave radio, although that's more of a justification for the retention of a single yardarm in later ships rather than Blake in this format. There was also, in the late 1870s and even in the early to mid-1880s, whilst these ships were not designed to have sails, they, in many navies, were designed to be able to rig emergency sails in the events that they somehow either ran out of fuel or their machinery plant packed up. Now, that wouldn't get you very fast, but it would at least get you somewhere. It was kind of an emergency limp home to nearest port function. But during Blake's career, most of these justifications went away. There were more electrical implements installed down below in most ships, although drying your laundry from the masts did remain quite a strong Navy tradition well into the Second World War and even beyond that. The radio antenna could obviously be strung from the very tops of the masts, and the reliability of steam plants continued to rise, the displacement of ships also continued to rise, and thus the emergency sail provision really was not necessary at all. And so, obviously, then these yardarms went away. And in fact, if you look at pictures of Blake and Blenheim in their latter part of their career, you'll notice they're down to just the one yardarm on each mast for supporting the signal halyards. There is one other minor factor, which is drill, because although Blake and Blenheim obviously were steam-only warships, the Royal Navy was not entirely divorced from mixed power plant warships at this time, and so the ability to train and drill people in how to get up onto yardarms and manage yardarms and lines, even if not necessarily having sails hoisted, would still be a useful way of either keeping crew skills up, or at least giving them a little bit of a heads up and an intro if large numbers of crew were going to rotate off to a ship like a third-class cruiser that might still actually utilise its sails. J. Taylor asks, the Blake class were built around the time that Harvey face-hardened plate armour became available, 1890-ish. Did the Royal Navy move to Harvey armour, or continue with the much inferior compound armour? The Royal Navy was actually quite an early adopter of Harvey-type armour. The thing you've got to remember is that The general principle of face-hardened armour was only really practically demonstrated at the very end of the 1880s. The specific Harvey-type process was only invented and proved in 1890, 1891, depending on whether you count when the first working plates were manufactured or when they were fully tested and then report issued. And then once that technology has been demonstrated, you've then got to reconfigure your steel plants to be able to actually make the stuff. And obviously, because Harvey armour is invented in the US, there's also issues with getting that knowledge to come from the US over to the UK, which means that, realistically speaking, the earliest dates at which you can actually start manufacturing Harvey plate armour in the UK is 1893, 1894, certainly in any significant quantities, and armour is one of those long lead items for a ship, especially a protected deck cruiser, because you have to order it in advance because it's a large amount of highly complicated steel, or in the case of compound armour, steel and iron, that you have to manufacture ahead of time. And particularly with a protected cruiser, that armour has to go in whilst the hull is being constructed because it's deep in the ship. With belt armour in other ships, it can be delivered a little bit later because ships are generally launched without their belt armour. That can be attached after when they're fitting out. But it means that with the Blakes, they're starting construction in the late 1880s. They're launched near enough in 1890, so they're being launched, i.e. they've already got armour in place, just as the Harvey process is being made public. So there's not really any opportunity to put Harvey armour on the Blakes, but a couple of cruiser classes down the line, you've got the Blakes, then the Edgars, then the Powerfuls. The Powerfuls do have Harvey armour, and that's because they are ordered in the early 1890s, which means that they can go, okay, there's this new armour technology, we'll order the armour for these ships to be made from that. And the reason you've got this particular ship, HMS Barfleur, on your screen during this question is because with battleships, it's a similar story. The Royal Sovereigns were launched with mostly compound armour because they were ordered and laid down before the Harvey process came about. Then you have Centurion and Barfleur, second-class battleships. They have some elements of Harvey armour because they are being built right as the Harvey process is just kicking in British industry. And then Renown, which is Admiral Fisher's flagship in the Mediterranean, which immediately follows Centurion and Barfleur, is entirely Harvey armoured, as are the Majestics, which are the next ships to be laid down after Renown. Ayayabamba asks, do you think, provided submarine clauses had not been added to the London Naval Treaty, that artillery submarines akin to Surcouf would have been far more common? And if so, how do you think they would have developed or impacted the war? I definitely think the cruiser submarine would have become more common. It was developing slowly. There were some issues with it, particularly in the realms of power generation because of the size of the sub you needed to mount any kind of significant armament. But the logic behind the cruiser submarine, to a certain extent, certainly in the interwar period, is relatively sound, at least for some cruiser submarine designs. I think the idea of taking a submarine armed with an exceptionally heavy main gun battery and using it as basically some kind of submersible surface raider where it toodles around on the surface looking for things to shoot, that is probably a bit of a dead end, because ultimately submarines are much more vulnerable than almost any other kind of surface warship to damage. If a surface-based warship takes a single hit that pierces the hull, even if it's a destroyer or something like that that doesn't have any armour, or a near miss that causes splinter damage, it's a problem, granted, but it's a problem that your damage control crews can patch and you can be getting on with. Whereas if you are a submarine and you have holes in your pressure hull, yeah, that's basically mission over. If you're lucky, you can limp home. That's really about all you can hope for. But the more and more I read about some other cruiser submarine concepts, such as X1, assuming that their concept had panned out and the technique had actually worked, they could have been quite interesting game changers in the Second World War, albeit that if they were allowed to continue being built, then obviously everybody is going to know that these things exist for at least a decade or more before the Second World War breaks out, which means the escort formations are going to be reconfigured to counter them. The main problem with X1 was just, as I mentioned earlier, the power plant just wasn't there for a sub this size. But for X1, the artillery concept was actually quite interesting. The idea was that there would be a fire control suite, as in a full fire control suite, the same way you'd have a fire control suite in a cruiser or something. And the fire control solution to whatever you were targeting would be calculated from periscope depth whilst you're still underwater. The guns, which you can see here, would be pre-trained and pre-aimed whilst still underwater, which of course also means you have, at least until someone spots the periscope, all the time in the world to just sit there and refine your firing control solution. Then you surface, and as soon as you surface, you are in theory able to immediately open fire with light cruiser grade weaponry. Now, the reason that's quite important is because it's the element of surprise, which is very important for any submarine. As we just mentioned, they are quite vulnerable. But it means that the escorts would have to be completely different, because if you've got essentially half a light cruiser firing at you from point-blank range, if you're an escort trawler, a corvette, maybe even a frigate, or if you're surprised, even a small destroyer, you could very well end up being crippled and or sunk without the ability to really return any fire, because you're going to be being hit by shells you cannot deal with at most likely fairly short ranges. So the number of hits is probably also going to be quite high. The essentially heavy gun threat now to convoy escorts is going to mean that you're going to need at minimum very large destroyers, think French contre-torpilleurs, or small cruisers accompanying every convoy, because hopefully they'll either have the mass or the armour to deal with a few flurries of these kinds of rounds, and you might have some expendable ASW escorts out on the periphery, and then you'll have a fast destroyer, large one obviously, or small cruiser in the centre of the convoy that can then either range out to the submarine or at least quickly manoeuvre in place to engage the submarine. And that completely changes the paradigm of obviously convoy attack warfare. And of course it means that whatever your large gun-based escort is going to be a prime target for the torpedoes of either cruiser subs if they choose to stay underwater, or more conventional subs that may be accompanying them. So essentially it's increased the cost and complexity of escorting any particular convoy, with the possibility that you still might catch a convoy by surprise. You might be able to, as I just said, sink the escorting gun-based heavy warship. There's all sorts of things the cruiser sub could still pull off. I mean, you could just go, okay, well, that's the ship that could potentially be a problem for me, so here's some merchant ships. I'm going to surface on the other side of these merchant ships, riddle them with gunfire, cripple and or sink them, and then quickly dive again. And if the gun warship tries to maneuver its way into a firing position, I still have torpedoes once I've dived again. Now, of course, there are obvious counters, not just a large ship with heavy guns, but you could also much more heavily arm the escorts, but again, you're increasing the price of the escorts. So there would have been counters, but yes, I think without the London Naval Treaty outlawing cruiser subs, I think you probably would have seen a lot more of them. Brendan Buersdorf asks, would the Key-class battleships have made better carrier conversions than Kaga? Absolutely, they would have, if they were in a state to be converted at the time of the Washington Naval Treaty. So if you look at the statistics comparing a Tosa class, of which Kaga is one, to a Key class, the Key is about the same width, so you're not going to get any additional width of hangar. So, but, near as much just makes no difference. Doesn't make too much odds. Speed, however, is considerably higher. The Keys were supposed to push 30 knots, and even if they fell a little bit short of their design speed and only made 29, that's still 2.5 to 3 knots faster than a Tosa class, and Kaga, of course, was the slowest of the Japanese fleet carriers, but even she managed to put on a couple of extra knots compared to her projected speed as a battleship. So even if the Key class underperformed slightly, realistically, based on other conversions, you can probably expect them to be hitting 31 knots and more likely 32 knots, which would mean they can keep up with the other Japanese carriers, which is quite a useful feature. She's considerably longer ranged as well because she is considerably longer. The Tosa class hull originally was 768 foot long. The Key class hull is 820 feet long, so it's just over 50 foot longer. That of course means a little bit more length on the hangar deck in theory. It means a longer flight deck, and because of the additional fuel, it means either you can go a lot further, or when you're converting it, you can still go a little bit further and but have considerably more ammunition and aviation fuel storage, as well as being able to store more aircraft. The Key class are really not that far removed from the Amagi class, all things told, apart from being, a generation newer in design terms. So you would have ended up with the not kaga, whatever they decide to call it, either Key or Owari, depending on which of the two gets converted, is going to be essentially another Akagi. C. Babylon asks, in the picture at around 3 minutes or 10 seconds in the USS Franklin video, I noticed that the twin 5-inch dual-purpose mounts on the front having what appeared to be doors underneath them. Was that for loading 5-inch ammunition? And if so, does that mean that the barbettes were really short? How armoured were the barbettes and magazines? I think this is the picture you're referring to, because at 3 minutes 10 there's part of a film, but this is at 3 minutes 16, so if you say picture, I think this is the one. But nonetheless, yes, 5-inch 38 mounts do have doors in them. They're at the back of the gun house to let people in and out. In terms of doors below them, well, the 5-inch 38 mounts you can see along here are sponsored out, so what you're seeing below those big door-shaped areas is actually openings onto the hangar deck. But this is a rather interesting point, in that the 5-inch 38, in most cases, not all but most, has a fully enclosed gun house. Now, of course, the colloquial shorthand when we see that is to say that it's a turret. But, as some people pointed out to me a few years ago, when you call it a turret, it kind of implies that it is a full turreted system, including magazines, shell hoists, and a barbette. When in fact they're not. They are gun mounts. They do not have barbettes. What they have is shell hoists going down into the magazines. And yes, that may sound somewhat vulnerable, but when you consider that the gun housing plating itself is between 1.5 to 2.5 inches, depending on which ship and which type of mount is in question, you suddenly realise that even the guns themselves are basically splinter-proof only. So in terms of armoured barbettes, the vast majority of 5-inch 38 caliber mountings did not have them. Simply put, there was just the shell hoists. As far as magazines are concerned, it really depends on the ship. Obviously, when you're looking at an Atlanta-class cruiser, it's not got a huge amount of armour, period, whereas, say, the 5-inch magazines on an Iowa-class battleship afforded a bit more protection, and the Essex-class somewhat in between. The man formerly known as Commenting Is What I Do asks, I read a piece that was talking about the environmental impacts of the Battle of the Atlantic. The article largely generalised World War II incidents as being frequent but surprisingly small when compared to later oil spills during the 60s and onwards. I presume this is a matter of tonnage difference, as it's only after World War II that you see the super large tankers like the Northumbria and Seawise Giant. Is that assumption correct? Partially. I mean, there's a number of reasons why World War II oil spills, particularly the Battle of the Atlantic oil spills, generally weren't as bad. Now, obviously, spilling any considerable amount of oil is not brilliant for the sea life and the environment wherever, whenever it happens, but particularly in the Battle of the Atlantic, most of the ships that were sunk tended to be sunk far from shore. And simply put, in terms of the impact that we would see, the oil from those ships is going to have an awful lot more time to spread out and get broken up before it arrives on the beaches, as opposed to the modern day, when if a tanker or even a cargo ship breaks apart and spills its oil, they tend to do that quite close to shore because it's usually because they've hit something. And so the direct flow of oil to the beaches is much, much shorter, and therefore it's going to be more concentrated regardless of volume. But then you also do have volume to consider. Now, a large tanker in World War II, like the SS Ohio of Malta convoy fame, the C2 standard tankers of the US Navy, or the tankers that converted into the Sangamon class carriers, etc., you're talking about roughly 120 to 150,000 barrels of oil capacity, which is a lot. I mean, you definitely don't want all of that venting anywhere, but that's for pretty much the largest tankers that on average you're going to come across. A modern crude carrier, not even an ultra large one, but your general super tanker, a small one will be hundreds of thousands, but normally you're looking at 1.5 million to 2, maybe even 2.5 million barrel capacity, and that's not the big ones. The really big ones are even more than that. So on average, you're looking at a modern supertanker with 10, 15 or 20 times the capacity of an oil tanker in World War II, which of course means if it breaches, even if not all the oil gets into the water, the scale of the spill is likely to be 10, 15, 20 times worse. And that's tankers. Bearing in mind that the vast majority of ships that were sunk during the Second World War are not tankers. If you look at a Liberty ship, which is actually relatively large as far as the average cargo ship being sunk in the North Atlantic is concerned, a fully loaded Liberty ship, i.e. fully bunkered up, has about 12,000 barrels of oil aboard. So it's another order of magnitude down even from a World War II tanker, which is an order of magnitude again down from a modern supertanker. And that's when it's fully loaded. Obviously, if it's sunk in the middle of the Atlantic, having burned off a bunch of its fuel, it's no longer fully loaded, and it may not have gone out fully loaded because that 12,000 barrels of fuel gives it over 70 days endurance, and if you're not planning on being on sea for anything close to 70 days, then why would the ship owner fuel it up completely to the brink? They might do, but they also might not. So you're talking about a ship that's probably, in terms of Battle of the Atlantic sinkings, probably got 3,000 to 5,000 barrels of oil aboard, assuming it's being sunk roughly mid-Atlantic. Which, when you compare 3,000 to 5,000 barrels to 1.5 to 2 million barrels, or even a few 100,000, the scale is completely different. And on top of that, you've got the fact that just because a ship is sunk, that doesn't necessarily mean that the oil spill is going to be its entire oil content. I mean, even when supertankers go aground, they don't always dump their entire oil contents into the water. So, I mean, just look at USS Arizona. She's still gradually leaking oil. The oil tanks that are breached in whatever attack sinks the ship will obviously, leak. But oil tanks generally are usually pretty good at staying sealed. So there will be ships down there that have oil tanks that have never been breached. And in fact, coming across World War II wrecks, the potential environmental impact of those tanks breaching now is a fairly major concern. So if you take your average freighter in the Battle of the Atlantic, as we said, might have 3,000 to 5,000 barrels of oil aboard, and then it gets hit and sunk, it might leak a few hundred, maybe 1,000 or 2,000 barrels of oil at most, but probably a few hundred. So you're talking about, on the average Battle of the Atlantic sinking is a couple of hundred barrels of oil, as I said, versus hundreds of thousands to millions of barrels. Plus it's out in the middle of the Atlantic, which is going to break up most of whatever oil slick is left long before it gets to the littoral environment. Now, of course, the flip side is that there are a lot more ships being sunk in World War II in the Battle of the Atlantic than there would be, supertankers going aground, but the sinkings are spaced out, and therefore the impact of any individual oil spill is also generally spaced out. Jeff asks, "Hi Drac, if USS Franklin had been a British carrier in the British Pacific Fleet, what would the results have been under a similar air attack?" So we actually obviously have Franklin's war damage report, which shows exactly where these bombs came in and hit. And we also have the armour layout for British carriers. Now, I'm going to use an Implacable class carrier because the Implacables were Britain's war-build fleet carriers. The Essex class are the US Navy's war-build fleet carriers, so I think they're pretty much directly comparable, at least in terms of time period. And of course, Implacable and Indefatigable were out there with the British Pacific Fleet later on. Now, if we overlay the Implacable class armour layout onto this diagram of Franklin, we can immediately see that the armoured flight deck area of the Implacable, which I've centred on the Essex class and scaled, because obviously Implacable is a slightly smaller ship, well, that armoured flight deck pretty much covers both of the areas where the bombs actually hit. And given that both of these bombs were 550-pounders, according to the damage report, which is pretty much the bomb type that the British armoured flight decks were designed to resist, and again, as you can see per the diagram, they're coming in at quite a shallow angle, you wouldn't have had anything like the disaster that occurred on Franklin. The bombs would have been completely rejected by the flight deck armour, and there's actually a reasonably decent chance they might even, if they didn't have immediately initiating fuses, they might even have just skipped straight off the deck and over into the sea, especially that forward bomb. Which, as you can see, obviously had something of a delay on its fuse. The aftmost bomb, that might have exploded on or near impact anyway. Now, that isn't to say there wouldn't have been casualties and there wouldn't have been damage, because if we're replicating the circumstances exactly, well, then, of course, Franklin was in the middle of spotting a strike package, so there were aircraft on deck, and there would theoretically be aircraft on the deck of Implacable or Indefatigable as well, so they would have burned. But as we see with kamikaze experiences with the British Pacific Fleet, if a British carrier takes a hit to a packed flight deck, yes, aircraft burn, aircraft are destroyed, and yes, some people unfortunately are killed, but the fire is relatively swiftly brought under control and doesn't actually threaten the ship in and of itself. And this is most likely what would have happened if there'd been an Implacable in place. The forward bomb, as I said, there's a fairly high chance of it just skipping straight over the deck, but the aft bomb would actually, be hitting in amongst the parked aircraft. So there would have been a reasonably large blaze aft, but then it would have been put out. The aircraft carcasses would have been pushed overboard. There would have been some casualties, but then the carrier would have been back in action, pretty much similar to how they experienced the Pacific War in real life. Josh Thomas Moore asks, during the Yangtze Incident, HMS London and HMS Black Swan tried to rescue HMS Amethyst, yet were driven off by Chinese field guns. But why was London driven off? I could understand a frigate or a destroyer being driven off by field guns, but I would have thought a cruiser's armour could at worst tank the hits long enough to help, especially against field guns. So what am I missing? Well, you're right in that London's armour was more than a match for the Chinese field batteries. The observations made by the crew seem to think that most of the Chinese field guns were 75mm or 3-inch or even smaller. You can see some of the damage she incurred here. And on top of that, a lot of the shells that they were firing were high explosive. So you can see, even though in this shot her belt armour is below the level of the quayside, so you've just got hull plating being hit, you can actually see that the vast majority of hits haven't actually even penetrated her hull, although they've dinged it up a fair bit. The problem, however, was twofold, looking through the crew accounts at the time. Firstly, there were multiple Chinese field batteries that they were coming across, and London actually went past and engaged 4 separate field batteries, and each time suppressed or demolished them with broadsides from her 8-inch and 4-inch guns. Because it turns out if you're a bunch of, open field guns at 400 to 500 yards, you tend to lose an engagement with 8-inch guns and a bunch of 4-inch guns. The problem, though, was partly the range. It was so close that obviously even a field gun firing under open sights can not just aim and reliably hit the ship, but aim and reliably hit parts of the ship. The very first hit from the first field battery was very, very close to the bridge, which was a little bit worrying because obviously that could cause significant problems for the crew. The other problem is that obviously whilst the armoured portions of London are fine, there's lots of crew in unarmoured portions and lots of systems in unarmoured portions. Now, if you're in an engagement at 15, 20, 25,000 yards, you can take your chances in this because you're not going to receive that many hits. So the presence of electrical circuits and so forth, such as, your fire control systems, it's an acceptable risk to have them outside the armoured sections to a certain degree. However, when you're being peppered by dozens upon dozens upon dozens of hits, something is going to break sooner or later. And at some point, I think it's somewhere between the second and third gun battery engagements, some electrical system aboard London failed that meant that the turrets had to go over to local fire control. Now, as you can see with B turret here, they do have their own rangefinders. That's not necessarily a massive problem. And they were taking some casualties from men that were in exposed positions because of what they had to do to make the ship work. That in and of itself also wasn't a massive issue, although they weren't particularly pleased with the casualties. However, what seems to have caused London to turn around is the following. Now, I'm going to read an extract from one of the survivors' accounts. And he says, "We ploughed on and waited for the fourth battery. By this time, the bridge was pretty adept at spotting the first telltale of puff of smoke in the reeds, eerily silent because the shell arrived before the report of the gun. This time, a shell detonated on or very near the compass platform. It killed one of the Chinese river pilots, mortally wounded the navigating officer, wounded the captain, and put the forward steering out of action. The aft steering position under the commander took over and, unable to see ahead, endeavoured to control 10,000 tons doing 20 knots up a winding river less than a mile wide. We were still under fire, so it was not a healthy place to stop or even slow down. The Admiral decided with reluctance that enough was enough, and in the face of the communist attack, he must not go on. He signalled to Amethyst, 'I'm sorry we cannot help you today. We shall keep trying. Stay where you are unless forced to move, in which case go upstream. Further instructions will follow.'" So essentially what it came down to was that London was obviously operating in very confined waters for a 10,000-ton cruiser at a reasonable clip, and as such, although she had multiple redundant steering positions, which are fine for a battle at sea, when it comes to navigating up, as they mentioned, a very winding river, you need to be able to see where you're going and make course corrections pretty much immediately. So that shell that hits the compass platform up top and takes out basically everybody there who's responsible for navigating the ship, either killing them or wounding them, meant that they were no longer in a position to safely steer their vessel. So if they had continued, London very well probably could have gone aground because she either wouldn't have had a turn reported quickly enough, or if it was reported, obviously without a direct visual reference to what was going on, the other steering positions might not have made the precise course corrections that were necessary. And so they had to suppress the fourth battery, get it to stop firing, and then very carefully turn the ship around and very carefully head back, which they could do at a slower speed because obviously they'd eliminated all the field gun batteries up to that point. So much as I hate to say it, much as it's almost like drawing teeth for me, HMS London going up the Yangtze River in the face of numerous light field artillery batteries of communist Chinese armies was probably one of the very few incidences in which a conning tower might actually have helped. This, I think, comes from the video on able seaman Just Nuisance and his pudding habits. John in Phoenix asks, "As an American, I must ask, what is spotted dick? From the context, it doesn't seem like it's an STD." You would be correct. It is a traditional British dessert item. It's a steamed pudding laced with sultanas or raisins, or both, as you can see on screen here. A relatively heavy mix, for that matter, when it comes to the, if you want to call it cake, pudding, whatever. The etymology of it is that it used to be called spotted dog, which in and of itself is a shortening dash, colloquialism for spotted dough. So spotted dough or spotted dog, referencing the fact it's obviously made from a dough. those were the old terms for this and many other puddings. Well, obviously they weren't all called spotted, but you would have treacle dog, which would be treacle pudding, etc., etc. And then in the 19th century, that kind of shifted over to spotted dick. Of course, that term used to mean many things, including advice in America in the early 1920s and 1930s. Just look at one or two of the, I think it's 30s, 40s, maybe even 50s Marvel comics. That often shows up as a meme these days. And yeah, so it's basically a holdover from that period, at least in terms of names. Usually served with custard. Personally, I don't tend to eat it, but that's because I just don't do most fruits and vegetables, and I particularly don't like raisins or sultanas. But the treacle sponge pudding variant I really like. We have a lot of named foods that these days would probably get you in trouble. I mean, there's another traditional British food, which is essentially a large meatball, but made from various offcuts and bits of offal, which, well, its traditional name, and the name that you will still find on the packaging by Mr. Brains, is nowadays the same term is used as a rather severe pejorative, which I can't even repeat on here because otherwise YouTube will probably demonetize the entire thing for hate speech. But feel free to look up that if you want. The Hand of the King asks, lately there was a horrible incident in a Scottish dry dock of a ship rolling over on her side whilst in the dry dock. Yeah, that was the former RV Petrel. Unfortunately. Are there any similar incidents occurring during the periods covered by the channel, and what was the outcome of the investigations? Yeah, unfortunately there are quite a number of ships that either fell over in dry dock or had a dry dock collapse around them, particularly with floating dry docks. In the immediate aftermath of Pearl Harbor, one of the dry docks needed to be cleared quite rapidly when they had a submarine in there, and the prop supports that held the thing upright collapsed, which wasn't particularly brilliant. The whole thing rolled over on its side. Fortunately, in that case, it was quote-unquote only a submarine, only weighed a few thousand tons, not under 2,000 actually, so it wasn't entirely out of the realm of possibility to pick the thing up, set it back upright, and get it back out the dry dock. So sometimes it could be set right, other times, unfortunately, not quite so much. This is HMS Valiant in earlier times, in her interwar career, in a floating dry dock, but a floating dry dock would actually be her bane later in life. Bearing in mind, Valiant and Queen Elizabeth were the only two fully modernised Queen Elizabeth class. She was sent over to the Eastern Fleet, later to become the British Pacific Fleet, and then she went into a floating dry dock in Ceylon, which is now Sri Lanka. Unfortunately, the people in charge of the floating dry dock didn't empty the floating dry dock tanks in the correct order, which overstressed it, so as it rose out of the water, it broke in half and sank again, but obviously that dumped Valiant rather violently back into the water and jammed her up against the bits of the floating dry dock as it went down, as a result of which she was basically crippled and had to limp back to Alexandria at less than 10 knots just to be able to get her in a seaworthy condition to get back to the UK. And at that point she was so badly damaged that, okay, fair enough, even a modernised Queen Elizabeth probably wasn't too long for this world in the aftermath of World War II, but she basically got back to the UK before even Japan had surrendered and was decommissioned and then sold for scrap after a short period as a training hulk. David Knowles asks, did the Royal Navy ever consider naming something after Just Nuisance, a sub or corvette perhaps, as the idea of a U-boat being sunk by HMS Nuisance would be quite ironic considering how much of a nuisance the U-boat actually was? Unfortunately, thus far, no, they haven't, but maybe it's something to suggest to the Royal Navy in the future. Certainly, I think, could be quite an amusing thing. I think part of the problem is that, at least in the more recent Royal Navy, they've tended to come up with naming conventions, obviously class naming conventions for different ships. So, well, the Type 423s were a mixture of towns and cities and all sorts of things. They were bit of a mixed bag, to be fair. The Type 42s were all named after cities, Sheffield, Edinburgh, etc., etc. The Type 45s are all D names. The Type 26s are going back to city names, Cardiff, Belfast, Glasgow, etc. But the River class OPVs are obviously named after rivers, but the Type 31s have a grab bag of names because apparently they're the Inspiration class. Yeah, whatever. So if they build an additional Type 31, or perhaps whatever the Type 32 turns out to be, maybe there's a point to be made to certain MPs that we could have an HMS Nuisance. Because after all, yeah, whether you want it to be or not, it's a reputation that a lot of Royal Navy sailors live up to. Reva asks, I got to visit the Royal Yacht Britannia and was struck at how subtly they designed the thing to be dual purpose. While it was of course on display with all the finery of its primary use, do we have any information on exactly how it would have appeared in its hospital ship guise, both internally and externally? And what was the extent of the process to perform the change? Did they have all the hospital kit just in a warehouse somewhere? Well, as a hospital ship, she obviously would have been painted all white with a massive red cross on the side to deter attack. Now, in terms of her conversion internally into a hospital ship, some elements, such as plans and stuff, I don't have access to, if they still exist, but I can read to you excerpts from a paper that actually discusses some of the details in question. So, and also you can look at when she was used as an evacuation ship for how they might have used her as a hospital vessel. But nonetheless, this is from a paper from around the time of her launch. So it says, for example, certain features have been embodied in the design which add to the value of the ship as a royal yacht, but are not altogether essential for that purpose. They would, however, be necessary if and when the ship is used as a hospital ship. Such features include ship's stabilizers, certain air conditioning, large laundry facilities, and comparatively high speed, none of which could be added on conversion as a hospital ship except at considerable additional expense and a long delay in completion. Now, some of those might seem a little bit odd, but obviously a stabilizer on a ship, especially in the 1950s, would be very useful for keeping the ship, well, stable whilst you're doing things like, I don't know, trying to operate on people. It mentions certain air conditioning, so the ship is air conditioned almost throughout, as opposed to just in staterooms, which is obviously good for climate control in both suppressing the spread of disease and keeping various areas contained. The laundry facilities, obviously being overly large, means that you can then wash, change, and process large amounts of medical laundry, sheets and so forth, overalls very quickly. And high speed is you need to get to the casualty area very quickly as well. And there's another page in there which is layout as a hospital ship. So I'll just read the entire page. In the initial stages of the design, the Medical Director General of the Navy was consulted about the requirements for the vessel in her role as a hospital ship. It was thus possible to proceed with the designs for a hospital ship and a royal yacht concurrently so that the conversion could be made in the most economical manner. In consequence, relatively little alteration to existing structure and equipment will be required in the unhappy event of war making the conversion necessary. The wards, which will accommodate 200 patients, will be located in the aft part of the ship. Most of the patients will be medical and surgical cases requiring normal hospital conditions, but provision has also been necessary for zymotic cases, whatever that is, and those suffering from tuberculosis. Zymotics will be accommodated in glazed cubicles built within the drawing room, and these cubicles, together with toilet and sanitary facilities, will be isolated from the remainder of the hospital. Tuberculosis cases requiring fresh air beds will be accommodated on part of the veranda, whilst others suffering from this disease will be berthed in wards in the space now occupied by the royal bedrooms. The remaining wards, including the cabins and the wardroom for sick officers and cabins for a few female patients, will be sited in the other royal apartments and in spaces now allocated to members of the royal household and staff. Particular care has been taken in the layout of bathrooms and sanitary facilities to ensure that as little alteration as possible will be necessary in these respects upon conversion. The operating theatre, with its annexes and its adjacent steriliser and anaesthetic rooms, will be on the lower deck, where there will also be the other specialist facilities, which include an ophthalmic room, a physiotherapy room, a pathological laboratory, and an X-ray room with adjacent darkroom. Full facilities for dental treatment, including a laboratory, will be located on the main deck. For the care and treatment of the patients, the Naval Medical Complement will comprise 8 medical and dental officers, 5 nursing sisters, and 47 male ratings, for all of whom existing accommodation can be readily adapted. The ship will be manned by merchant navy crew accommodated forward in 2 and 4 berth cabins in accordance with usual merchant ship practices. Some partitioning of the present mess decks will be necessary for this purpose. It also goes on to note that the galley, like the laundry facilities, was deliberately oversized so that it could supply food for a full complement of patients and staff. It was also pointed out that they used geared turbine machinery specifically because of the necessity of hospital usage, because diesel would have been, it notes, a very attractive choice because of endurance, but diesel engines of the 1950s produced too much vibration for sensitive medical equipment. So hopefully that clears up some of that question. King Brock asks, were there any instances of a warship towing another warship in combat? I presume you mean into combat, but yes, I mean, there are 100 probably of examples of warships being towed by other warships in combat when they've had something fail, or immediately after combat, but also being towed into combat is a thing, albeit it's nowhere near as common these days as it used to be. So, for example, if you watch the Armada video, you'll know, as depicted here, that at one point the Spanish used their galleasses to tow the Rata Encoronada, one of their largest ships, to try and bring that ship's gun batteries to bear, despite the fact the wind was relatively negligible and would have been against them anyway. So that's one example. Ships that lost their masts during a line of battle approach or an approach towards the line of battle would sometimes pick up a friendly tow if their captain was on good enough terms with the other ships. And this meant that sometimes ships were just towed along into battle, especially while they were rigging their own auxiliary masts and sails and so forth. And then once you're in combat, if a ship itself got crippled, a crippled vessel could be made to surrender by the enemy, so it's better to go and get one of your own ships to go and tow it out. And in fact, that was one of the main jobs of frigates in Age of Sail battles, although occasionally ships of the line could do this as well. Infante Don Pelayo, during the Battle of Cape St. Vincent, for instance, going and hauling Santissima Trinidad away, because otherwise she was about to get captured by the Royal Navy. But instances of ships being towed by other ships whilst in combat as opposed to after combat tend to die away quite rapidly during the 19th century, because as steam takes over, well, firstly, in an Age of Sail fight, if a ship hauled over to grab another ship and take it in tow and then get back up to speed, you might lose your place in the line, but you'd probably get involved in the fight anyway, because the fight would be going on for hours. Whereas in the Age of Steam, when you're in the late 19th century, you might be advancing at 15, 18 knots, and in the 20th century, 20 to 30 knots. If a ship hauled over to take another ship in tow, one, the total speed that they could get up to would be nowhere near as close to battle speed as it was in the Age of Sail, and two, the battle would have moved on miles and miles and miles away from them by the time they got everything hooked up. Plus, with a Age of Sail fight, if your sails get knocked out and your masts get knocked down, that's a problem, but your fundamental fighting power and ability to stay afloat has not been dramatically affected, so hauling what's essentially at that point a floating gun battery into action is quite beneficial. Whereas once you get to the Age of Steam and the engines are below the waterline, if you've been hit so badly all your machinery is out, you probably have some very major flooding going on, at which point, movement, not really a thing you want to be doing until you've completely stabilised the situation. Brian Smith asks, we know Yamamoto used the threat of resigning to get his way. What if the Japanese Navy called his bluff and accepted his resignation? How would that have changed the early part of the war? The problem is something like this is insanely difficult to predict, because in the Japanese Navy, and I'm not saying this is unique to the Japanese Navy, it does happen in other navies as well, but we know it definitely happened in the Japanese Navy in this time period, senior officers tended to attack a gaggle of protégés, and those protégés could be anyone who was, one rank down to several ranks down. If somebody then becomes ill, has to leave the service, or just dies, then one of their proteges it will probably step in. So if Admiral Yamamoto had had a heart attack or something, or his plane had crashed, then one of his senior proteges probably would have been in the running to take his position. Whereas if he has been, well, if he's resigned and his resignation has been accepted, his star is now falling, which would mean that you'd end up with all of his proteges pretty much on ice and not in the running. The same thing happened with the Yamato class with its design process. Admiral Fujimoto was initially kind of the main person who would be in charge. Then his career took a brief nosedive when he was held responsible for the Tomozuru incident. And the most obvious successor, Captain Izake, because he was seen as a protege of Fujimoto, he was also put on ice. And then Admiral Fukuda, who was a protege of Admiral Hiraga, who was a much more conservative designer, he ended up in charge instead. And that was purely just because of one incident. So if Yamamoto and all of his followers are not seen as being in favour anymore, then you might get somebody else. But the thing is, although Yamamoto was driving for the creation of the Kido Butai, there were other admirals who weren't necessarily his proteges who were also in favour of it. And there were still, as with all the other navies, some battleship-focused admirals. So in terms of how it could have changed the early part of the war, it could look pretty much the same, because you could get someone with very similar ideas. Or it could be completely and utterly different. You might get someone who's incredibly conservative, mainly still thinks in terms of the battleship battle line, and is not really that fond of aircraft carriers, and is also maybe not particularly fond of a mass attack on Pearl Harbor, or anything in between. Unfortunately, with this particular scenario of him resigning and the resignation being accepted, it's very, very difficult to predict who exactly would end up in charge next. It's not like there's a specific clear line of succession purely based on seniority, the way it would have been perhaps in some older navies, or even in the Japanese Navy 50, 100 years earlier. Greb asks, since we know you think of Bismarck's design as being inefficient, I was wondering, could you compare the efficiency of Bismarck versus Bayern's design? Or which is more efficient for the years they were built? Do you think the Bismarck design is an evolution of the Bayern, or a completely different design? And lastly, do you think the Allies would consider a modernised Bayern a real threat, enough to put the same effort to sink it as some other ships? I mean, yeah, it would be seen as a threat. Regardless almost of the state of modernisation, a battleship is a battleship is a battleship. It can, even an old World War I battleship can deal with anything that's not a battleship as convoy escorts, and it can tank anything, gunfire, from things that aren't battleships, as long as it keeps range open. So even if Bayern had only been modernised to, say, the extent of Royal Oak, she'd still be a massive threat that would require putting down. If she'd been modernised to, say, the state of Warspite, Queen Elizabeth, Valiant, or Renown, definitely a threat that needs to be put down. And if the Germans had somehow managed to retain her and gone full in and gone Italian style and popped her up to fast battleship speeds, absolutely this thing is going to... Well, at that point, you're basically facing Bismarck, only slightly smaller. So, yeah, a modernised Bayern would definitely attract almost as much, if not more, the same amount of attention as Bismarck did. It might attract just a fraction less, because, depending on the degree of modernisation, because an unmodernised Bayern, something like Rodney or Nelson, might be considered, they're powerful enough to kill it, but they might also be fast enough to catch it, as opposed to, Bismarck, which needed fast capital ships to catch in the first place. As far as, is Bismarck an evolution of the Bayerns? To a certain extent, in as much as she is the next full-scale German battleship constructed after the Bayerns, but in terms of what influences the design process, there's obviously a lot of foreign ships being built in the interwar period. That's influencing Bismarck's design. Plus, although Bayern is the last capital ship the German Imperial Navy actually constructs and completes, she's not the last capital ship they design. There's the L-20E Alphas, for example. There's a slew of both battle cruisers and battleships that the Germans have designed after Bayern, which they can also draw on. Plus, of course, there's the Mackensons and the Ersatz Yorks. And I mean, when you look at capability-wise, if you compare the Bayerns, the Ersatz Yorks, and Bismarck, Bismarck is closer to the Ersatz Yorks than she is to the Bayerns. You know, armour thickness is much more similar to the Ersatz York than it is to Bayern. They're all three designs have 8 15-inch guns in 4 twin turrets, but the Ersatz Yorks are 27 to 28 knot ships. Bayern is 21 knots, and obviously Bismarck is 30 plus. So yeah, you can probably draw a lot more parallels between the Ersatz Yorks than you can and the Bismarck than you can the Bayerns and Bismarck. Now, efficiency-wise between the two, you know, that kind of comparison would be in a video in and of itself, but very, very crudely looking at Bismarck and Bayern, if you compare their power output and speed, it can be a little bit misleading because, of course, you're talking about 20 plus years of advancement in power plants, and of course, Bismarck is designed for 30 knots, Bayern's designed for 21, but for the sake of interest, Bayern generates a 1.2 shaft horsepower per ton. Bismarck generates 3.55 essentially horsepower per ton. But interestingly, if you compare speed to displacement, you need about 1,360 tons of Bayern for every knot of speed that it goes up to its maximum of 21 knots. You need 1,390 tons of Bismarck for every knot that it goes, getting up to 30 knots. So, although those figures are close, obviously Bismarck's going a lot faster, which we know it requires an awful lot more power and a lot more efficient hull design. So, in terms of speed and engine power, Bismarck is well ahead of Bayern, but that's not really a surprise. You know, 20 plus years, you'd hope that would be the case. But in terms of protection, I mean, in terms of firepower, they've both got 8 15-inch guns. Yes, Bismarck's are more powerful. Again, they're more modern guns. They should be, but on a much larger hull. But then you look at the protection. Bayern actually has a thicker belt than Bismarck does. It's a 13.8 inches compared to 12.6. Now, granted, Bismarck's belt is made out of late interwar German armour steel, which along with British armour steel has qualitatively increased a little bit in resistance, but still, you know, Bayern physically has, you know, well over an inch thicker belt. The deck is surprisingly, especially bear in mind they follow similar deck profiles, surprisingly on Bayern not all that far removed from Bismarck's. Bismarck's has a maximum, and bear in mind this is maximum deck thickness of 4.7 inches. Bayern is less than an inch behind at 3.9, near enough 4 inches, which isn't bad, especially for a ship that's, you know, way, way, way smaller. And turret-wise, there's only 0.4 of an inch in it. Bayern's turret's 13.8 inches, Bismarck's 14.2 on the turret faces. So, given how close they are in values, and given that Bayern is actually, you know, a thicker belt on a much, much smaller ship, in terms of how much protection you're getting per ton, Bayern is massively more efficient than Bismarck. So, yeah, take that as you will. Of course, some of Bismarck's massive size is required by speed, but as well, even though Littorio is a treaty breaker, as Littorio showed and as Richelieu showed, you don't need all that displacement to actually get up to this level of speed. So, yeah, the fact that outside of the rather obvious advances in engine technology, the Bayern even comes within shouting distance of Bismarck, yeah, Bayern is a much more efficient design. Paul Frederick asks, in reading about the US Navy in the Pacific, it seems that when the bulk of the fleet was in Ulithi, there were issues with pollution, sewage, trash, and oil leaks. Did warships have holding tanks for sewage? How do they manage in confined harbours if they weren't tied up to a dock with shore disposal? Well, bearing in mind we're talking about early 20th century practices, in peacetime, if you were faced with that kind of situation, you might just discharge it in harbour anyway, or you might discharge at sea before you enter the harbour, depending on basically how much you like that particular harbour. Yes, warships do have holding tanks for sewage, at least by World War II. And that's for a few different reasons, apart from anything, when you're moored up next to in a harbour, in a friendly harbour, people don't generally appreciate your ship just gradually spreading a slick of waste around you. But there's also some actual tactical elements to it as well, because if you are constantly discharging waste, that is one rather noisome way of actually following your progress, especially if you're an entire fleet, especially with aerial recon involved. But holding tanks only have so much capacity. They do have to be flushed occasionally. And if you are at anchorage in Ulithi, and you might be at anchorage for quite a while in Ulithi, and there's a lot of ships there, and to be honest, even if you were tied up to the side, to some kind of quayside or something in Ulithi, it's not exactly the world's largest place in terms of inhabitation. The chances of Ulithi having a sewer treatment plant that can deal with a fleet like this sitting in harbour all the time, that's not happening. And unfortunately, that means that once the tanks reach a certain amount of capacity, have to be flushed. And if you're in the harbour, you're probably not either going to want to or get authorization to sail out into the open ocean to discharge your sewage tanks, then come back again. It's going to mess up all sorts of scheduling. And if there was a Japanese sub lurking offshore, an unescorted carrier popping up to discharge its sewage tanks, would be payday for a Japanese sub. So, you have to discharge your tanks where you are, except that obviously if you've got hundreds of ships doing that on a near continuous basis, and you're in a relatively confined harbour, it's going to build up. And finally, Rebel Skvirl asks, how exactly was minesweeping accomplished during the period of the World Wars? Well, there are two primary ways if you're covering both World Wars. The more traditional way, which is typical, is what you can see illustrated here. And this uses paravanes, sometimes called sweeps, sometimes called all sorts of different things, but basically kind of the winged torpedo-y things you quite often see on various ships. And the idea is that, as you can see in diagram section 1, the ship will stream its paravanes out to either side, and that's why sometimes when you see ships in Drydock, look at pictures of the bow of USS Texas at the moment, for example, you'll see these little hooks down, not hooks, you'll see ring attachments right on the tip of the bow at the very bottom. This is to run your paravane chains through. They then run either side of the ship, and then as you see in item 2, and as explained down there on the bottom right, the mines, which are typically moored mines, will then get caught on the wire, which is being kept taut by the hydroplanes of the paravane, which are trying to stream it away from the ship. Then the mine will either have its cable cut directly by the wire, or it will run down to the paravane where there will be wire cutting teeth or blades aboard. That severs the cable for the mine pops to the surface, and the mine can then be detonated by gunfire. Now, of course, you don't want to do this with your full-scale warship, so you would usually use minesweeping trawlers and the such, but they're essentially using the same kind of technology in subtle variations. But the raw idea of you trail some wire with something at the end of it to catch and cut the cabling on the mine is essentially how most minesweeping was done. Now, there were some free-floating mines, and in those cases it's a case of edge around very carefully, look out for them, and then pop them with gunfire, but free-floating mines tend to just drift away out of the area in relatively short order, so they're not exactly common. But then, of course, you have the magnetic mines, and the magnetic mines don't necessarily need to be moored. They can sit on the seabed if you're in shallower water, or they can be moored a lot deeper than contact mines, which would mean that obviously the paravanes, which tend to be kind of horizontal, as you can see in the diagram, may not actually contact them. Obviously, for contact mines, they have to be able to contact the ship, so they have to be, moored at a depth such that they are hovering at the level or above the keel of their targets, hence the paravane cables can catch them. So with magnetic mines, that's when you see various interesting things. You either have minesweepers equipped with very deep artificially deep running paravanes, and this is one of the reasons why minesweepers are favoured as for having wooden hulls, things that aren't going to set off the magnetic mines. Or you can do things like the RAF did with the Wellingtons and so forth, and attach those big round rings to them, which are magnetic field generators, and then you fly that low over the water and use an artificially massive magnetic field to detonate the mines. And, well, thanks for listening, everyone. You have reached the end of Drydock, episode 264. Do look forward to seeing you again in another video. Thanks very much for listening to this one.